Indigenous peoples of this continent are known in Nihiawawin as Sinuak, and we have existed here since each of our independent creation stories. However, some estimates by Eurocentric archaeologists assume that indigenous peoples could only have been here for the last 15,000 to 80,000 years. Even if indigenous peoples conceded to those low estimates, it's a fact that we've existed here far, far before the colonizers. Colonization has existed in many forms, going back to Greek and Phoenician-era land conquest. Contemporary colonialism, as we know it, has existed more recently on the northern and southern continents, beginning when Christopher Columbus mistakenly landed in the Taino-occupied islands 530 years ago. Columbus would immediately begin warring with indigenous peoples and enslaving children. As abhorrent as his immediate crimes were at the time when he justified his actions, it's not always about Columbus. The problem exists with all of his support by the church and the colonizing nations supporting those same ideologies. Among those supports are cartographers, deciding borders around natural lands and peoples for the purposes of colonization and extraction. The famous mapmaker Amerigo Vespucci would have both the northern and southern continents named after him. These lands, which have different names to every indigenous group, are now colonially referred to as North and South America. To Nahiwak, and some, but not all other indigenous groups, this northern continent is referred to as Turtle Island. However, it was the French and British who would be at war with each other for the same lands, which they'd referred to as Canada since the 1500s. War, starvation, and disease would follow. The Hudson Bay Company only further exacerbated this, encouraging the overhunting of bison, beaver, and other fur-bearing animals which had previously been relied upon in reciprocal relations by indigenous peoples. All the while, smallpox, influenza, measles, and whooping cough would rip across the prairies, causing more devastation per population than what the bubonic plague had only recently done in Europe in the 14th century. Estimates on the population of indigenous peoples on this continent range between 60 and 90 million, while at the same time in 1492, European populations were nearly the same, with just over half of the land area. The first understood peace treaty between indigenous peoples and European powers on the lands colonially referred to as Canada came in 1701 through the Great Peace of Montreal. New France would sign the treaty with almost 40 other First Nations, which were represented by an estimated 1,300 representatives. However, French and British colonizers continually took advantage of declining populations of indigenous peoples who were now subject to their war, starvation, and sickness as a result of European contact. King George III would sign the Royal Proclamation in 1763, which recognized indigenous title to the land, but determined Great Britain to be the sole colonizing nation with exclusive access as a treaty signatory. America would defect from the Commonwealth by 1776. The colonizers maintained attempts at genocide and diaspora, removing indigenous peoples from their lands and distancing them from plant and animal relations. This, also colonizers could establish war forts, trade ports, and move in settlers to do the same. The Dominion of Canada, as it had been known at the time, continually created laws with the blatant goal of assimilation and enfranchisement of indigenous peoples into Canadianism. Nahiwak and other Isinuak depended on the bison and used every part of the animal. French and British colonizers would continually slaughter the bison, ensuring train routes from eastern to western Canada, speeding up the colonial process. The last of the free-roaming bison, which once numbered around the 30 million, was killed in the late 1800s. It was during this era in the Dominion of Canada that the British initiated treaty-making with various indigenous peoples following the direction and pace of developments of that east-to-west train route. Treaties 1 through 7 were each signed in succession between 1871 and 1877, while negotiators would make false promises and assurances which have since gone unfulfilled. The Indian Act was signed in 1876 and had many adhesions, with the last change in 1985. The Indian Act banned Indigenous ceremony, made Indigenous peoples require permissions from an Indian agent before they were able to leave a reserve, would make attendance to residential school mandatory, outlawed dancing entirely, outlawed potlatches, and gave away lands which were already dedicated as reserves for Indigenous peoples to settlers, as long as those settlers promised to farm on those lands. Canada used this act to determine who does or does not have status as a Section 35 Indian, now an Indigenous person. A Section 35 Indian would lose their status if they married a person without status, voted in federal elections, if they had ever sought a lawyer, or if they'd ever attended post-secondary school. Only some of these Indian Act laws were revoked in 1960. Outside of enfranchisement, Indigenous women also faced the consequences of forced sterilization. These heinous acts against Indigenous women officially began in Alberta through the Sexual Sterilization Act of 1928. While the process began elsewhere, Alberta is known to have been the biggest perpetrator of forced sterilization against Indigenous women. This process was challenged only after it was identified as a war crime following World War II, but would continue with the most recent cases of forced sterilization happening against Indigenous women in 2017 in the Saskatoon Health Region. The child welfare system, beginning in 1951, would overlap with the era of residential schools. Indigenous children were viewed as a responsibility of the territory or province, in which they became wards of the state, during the era now known as the 60s scoop. Children taken from their families were often removed from their language, culture, customs, and heritage. Removing children from their families continues today in what's now referred to as the millennial scoop, in which there are now more Indigenous children in foster care today than there were Indigenous children enrolled in residential schools during the height of residential schooling in 1931.